The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry hornets in the windowless conference room on the seventh floor of the Pentagon's E-ring. Mark Reynolds sat rigid in his cheap suit, the one he'd bought for his wife's funeral 3 years earlier. His colleus hands that had once gripped an M4 in Fallujah, rested flat on the polished oak table, while three-star General Harlan Voss droned on about strategic realignments in the Levant. Mark wasn't supposed to be here. He was a GS9 logistics analyst, the kind of guy who moved paper clips and requisition forms, not the kind invited to closed-door briefings. But his boss had called in sick, and someone had to deliver the latest fuel consumption projections for the upcoming carrier group deployment off the coast of Iran. Mark had read the slides. He knew the numbers didn't add up. "Gentlemen," Voss said, tapping a laser pointer at a map that showed glowing red arrows slicing through Tehran's suburbs, "this operation buys us 20 years of uncontested airspace for our closest partner." 20 years. The word partner hung in the air like a bad smell. Everyone in the room knew it meant Israel. No one said it out loud. Mark kept his face blank, but inside something cracked. His son, Caleb, had died in a dusty convoy outside Mosul 11 years ago. The official story was enemy fire. Mark had believed it until last month, when a faded thumb drive arrived in his mailbox with no return address. The drive contained encrypted emails between a senior aide to Senator Richard Langford and a handler at the Israeli embassy. The subject line of one read, "Phase 3 Public Support Calibration for Iran Strike." Attached was a spreadsheet titled, "Casualty Tolerance Thresholds American Public." He had stared at that spreadsheet for 3 hours, whiskey burning in his throat, until the numbers blurred. 23,000 American dead was listed as acceptable collateral if it secured permanent forward operating bases along Israel's northern border. Now, sitting in this room, Mark realized the war they were planning wasn't for America. It was for someone else's map. He waited until the briefing ended, slipped the classified folder into his briefcase, and walked out of the building like any other mid-level drone. The Virginia night was cold and smelled of jet fuel and wet leaves. He drove his battered Ford pickup west on Route 7, past the glowing monuments of Arlington, past the strip malls where soldiers' families shopped with food stamps, and didn't stop until he reached the rundown motel outside Winchester. Room 214 smelled of mildew and old cigarettes. Mark plugged the thumb drive into his laptop, opened Tor, and began copying files. Every name, every wire transfer, every memo that showed how billions in US tax dollars flowed through shell companies in Cyprus before landing in Tel Aviv defense contractors, how Senator Langford's re-election PAC received 7-figure consulting fees the same week he co-sponsored the new supplemental aid bill, how Pentagon planners quietly adjusted casualty estimates upward because our partners' security requirements supersede domestic political optics. He didn't know he was already being watched. 2 hours later, a black Suburban with government plates rolled into the motel parking lot. 3 men in dark windbreakers stepped out. They moved like men who had done this before. Mark heard the soft click of a lockpick set. He grabbed the laptop, the thumb drive, and the Glock he'd kept since his discharge and climbed out the bathroom window into the freezing rain. He hit the ground running, boots splashing through puddles, heart hammering like it had in the streets of Ramadi. Behind him, flashlights swept the room. He made it to the truck, jammed the key in, and peeled out onto the highway. In the rearview mirror, headlights appeared. The chase lasted 43 minutes. Mark used every trick he'd learned in convoy escort school, swerving across lanes, cutting through construction zones, finally ditching the truck behind a Walmart in Hagerstown and stealing a rusted minivan from the employee lot. By dawn he was in Pennsylvania, heart still racing, the laptop burning a hole in his backpack. He needed help. Someone who still believed in the country they'd sworn to defend. Sarah Clean answered on the third ring. She had been Caleb's godmother, a fiery investigative reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer until the paper gutted its foreign desk. Now she ran a tiny Substack that nobody read. Her voice was gravel from too many cigarettes and not enough sleep. Mark, Jesus, you sound like you're in a war zone. I am, he said. Meet me at the old steel mill in Bethlehem. Bring a clean laptop and every encryption program you own. She met him at noon. The mill's skeletal remains loomed like dinosaur bones against the grey sky. Sarah looked thinner than he remembered, eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. He handed her the thumb drive without a word. She plugged it in. For 10 minutes, the only sound was the wind rattling through broken windows. When she finally looked up, her face was pale. This is treason, Mark. Real treason. Not the kind they scream about on cable news. This is the kind that starts wars so one country can redraw the map while we pay the butcher's bill. I know, he said. They killed my boy for it. I want them to feel what that costs. They spent the next week moving between cheap motels and abandoned warehouses, piecing the story together like a bomb. Every document pointed back to the same network. Langford, 3 other senators, 2 Pentagon undersecretaries, and a rotating cast of senior advisors who never appeared on any official org chart, but whose names appeared on passenger manifests for private jets to Tel Aviv. They learned that the coming war with Iran had been greenlit, not because of nuclear weapons. Intelligence showed Iran was years away, but because Israel's leadership had demanded a decisive strike before their own domestic political window closed. American soldiers would die so Israeli elections could be won. American cities would tighten their belts so Israeli settlements could expand. Sarah wrote the first draft in a Red Roof Inn outside Allentown, fingers flying across the keyboard, while Mark stood guard at the window with the Glock. When she finished, she read it aloud in the dim lamplight. Her voice cracked on the paragraph about the mothers in Ohio and Texas who would open doors to casualty officers in dress blues because a foreign lobby had decided American blood was cheaper than political risk. Mark's eyes stung. He thought of Caleb's last letter, written on the back of a ration pack. Dad, sometimes I wonder if we're fighting for the right reasons anymore. They uploaded the story to Sarah's Substack at 3:17 a.m. On a Tuesday. Within 6 minutes it had 40,000 views. Within an hour it was on every alternative platform. Within 2 hours the site was hit with a massive DDoS attack. They knew the clock was running. The first attempt on their lives came the next morning. Mark was buying burner phones at a Walmart when the black SUV jumped the curb. He dove behind a parked car as bullets punched through metal. Shoppers screamed. A mother pulled her toddler down behind the shopping cart. Mark returned fire, 2 precise shots that shattered the SUV's windshield, then sprinted through the store, out the garden center, and into the woods. Sarah met him at a prearranged gas station 20 miles away. Her hands shook as she drove. They're not even pretending anymore. They ran north, then west, zigzagging through Pennsylvania's back roads, sleeping in the minivan, eating gas station burritos. Every night, Mark checked the growing online firestorm. Hashtags trended. Veterans groups shared the documents. Gold Star mothers posted photos of their dead sons beside screenshots of the casualty spreadsheets. But power has teeth. On the 8th day, they reached a safe house in the Allegheny Mountains, an old hunting cabin owned by a Marine buddy who asked no questions. Mark was chopping firewood when the first helicopter thumped overhead. He dropped the axe and ran inside. Sarah was already at the laptop, uploading the final cache of documents to a dozen mirror sites. I rigged it so if they kill us, it all dumps automatically. The door exploded inward. 3 men in tactical gear swept in. Mark fired first, dropping the lead man. Sarah screamed as a bullet caught her in the shoulder. Mark tackled the second attacker, felt a knife slice across his ribs, and drove his elbow into the man's throat. The third man raised his rifle. Mark looked straight into the barrel and smiled. "Go ahead," he said. "The truth's already out there. You can't shoot the internet." The man hesitated half a second, long enough for Mark to lunge. The rifle went off. Pain exploded in Mark's chest. He felt himself falling, heard Sarah screaming his name, felt her hands pressing against the wound. The last thing he saw was her face, streaked with tears and blood, as she whispered, "We did it, Mark. They can't hide anymore." He died with a taste of iron in his mouth and the distant sound of sirens rising up the mountain. Sarah survived. She spent 3 weeks in a military hospital under armed guard before a federal judge, shaken by the sheer volume of leaked evidence and the public fury, ordered her release. The story had broken the country in two. Protests choked Washington. Veterans occupied the National Mall. A freshman congresswoman from Ohio read the casualty spreadsheets aloud on the House floor until the speaker gavelled her down in tears. Senator Langford resigned the day before he was scheduled to testify, citing health reasons. 2 undersecretaries were found dead in apparent suicides. The carrier group never left port. The strike on Iran was quietly shelved, but none of that brought Mark back. Sarah stood at his grave in a small cemetery outside his hometown in western Pennsylvania on a cold April morning. The wind whipped across the fields where Mark had once taught Caleb to throw a baseball. A crowd of 200 people stood behind her, veterans in faded fatigues, mothers clutching folded flags, ordinary Americans who had read the documents and finally understood the price of other people's wars. Sarah placed a single dog tag on the headstone. It was Caleb's. She had kept it all these years. "I told him I'd finish it," she said, voice steady despite the tears. "He paid for all of us." Every mother who will never get that knock on the door because the war never happened. Every kid who gets to grow up without learning that their government can trade their future for another country's borders. He paid in full. She stepped back. The crowd remained silent for a long minute. Then someone began to clap. Slowly at first, then louder, until the sound rolled across the cemetery like thunder. Far away in Washington, a new aide walked into Senator Langford's former office. The walls had been repainted. The files had been shredded. But on the desk lay a single printed page, the cover sheet of Mark Reynolds' leaked documents. Someone had circled one line and read, "Casualty tolerance thresholds American public." The aide stared at it for a long time. Then he took out his phone, photographed the page, and sent it to an encrypted chat. The war for the truth wasn't over. It had only just begun. Outside, the cherry blossoms were beginning to bloom along the tidal basin, pink and fragile against the marble monuments. Tourists paused for selfies in front of the Lincoln Memorial, unaware that beneath the polished surface of their government, the same machinery still hummed quieter now, more careful but still turning, still calculating how much American blood was worth in foreign coin. Mark Reynolds would never see those blossoms again. But somewhere in the heartland, a teenage boy who had lost his father in a different war opened the leaked documents on his phone. He read the numbers, he read the names, and for the first time in his life, he felt something sharper than grief. He felt anger, and anger, once awakened, is hard to bury. The minivan Sarah had driven that final night still sat in an impound lot outside Pittsburgh. Inside the glove compartment, beneath a blood-stained map, lay Mark's last handwritten note, scrawled on the back of a motel receipt. "If you're reading this, keep going. They only win if we stay quiet. Tell my son I loved him enough to die for the truth. Tell every mother the next knock on the door doesn't have to come." Mark, the ink had smeared from rain and tears, but the words remained clear. Across America, people read them, shared them, whispered them in living rooms and VFW halls and high school cafeterias. The story didn't end with Mark's death. It multiplied. and in the quiet hours before dawn, when politicians and lobbyists thought the country was asleep, they began to feel it, the slow, unstoppable shift of ordinary people who had finally looked at the ledger and realized the price was too high. They began to ask the question Mark had asked in that Pentagon briefing room, the question that had cost him everything. Whose war is this, anyway? And for the first time in decades, the answer no longer belonged only to the men in the earring. It belonged to the people who paid for it with their children, their taxes, and their trust. Mark Reynolds was buried under an American flag, but the truth he uncovered refused to stay in the ground. It walked the streets now, quiet and determined, wearing the faces of mechanics and teachers and veterans and mothers. It waited in the shadows of power, patient as winter, and it would not be silenced again. Word count 4012.